Not far north of Bournemouth, about halfway between the villages of Witchampton and Cranbourne, lies the site of Knowlton Church. While the church itself casts a familiar figure, fashioned as it is in the Norman style, with a squat boxy spire looming above the decrepit remains of its nave and chancel, the nature of its surroundings distinguishes it from its fellows. While other churches of its type can be found nestled within a patchwork quilt of verdant fields, or sheltered beneath a woodland's comforting canopy, the church at Knowlton sits at the centre of an ancient circular henge, far older than any artefact of the Christian faith. Moreover, it's widely known as one of the most haunted locations in the southwest. Although the ruined church that now sits at its core was erected more than 1,000 years ago, having been built not long after the first King William's conquest, it's far from the first to be built on that site, and far from the first to fall. You see, while the land that they rest upon may tolerate them for a time, just as you or I might tolerate a pimple or a boil, sooner or later blemishes like these are duly treated and expunged. The henge, you see, owes its presence to powers far more ancient and ingrained than the carpenter's cult that usurped them. Gods and goddesses that built the land with their own 2 hands and laid their bodies beneath the earth to grant us life, who were born from the sun and the moon and who left the fields and the forest and the streams to watch over us. Gods and goddesses in whose name the first henges and barrows were built. Despite the incursion of the foreign faith, they still hold sway over Knowlton and to this day demand vengeance for the insults they received. You see, long ago, long before the Norman conquerors ever stepped foot on our shores, the raised earthen embankment that remains at Knowlton today formed the footing of a great henge made of stones more imposing and magnificent than those of the Pretender on Salisbury Plain. Stones that were a shimmering, glistening grey, and sung with the sacred buzz of life itself. For tens of thousands of years the first folk would congregate here to celebrate each solstice and give thanks to the heavens for the world that surrounded them. A tradition they passed on to those who came after and was honoured for centuries by the Celtic people that followed. Not even the Roman invaders sought to quell or contain the ceremonies that took place at the henge, happy as they were to let others worship as they might so long as Caesar was given his due. All was well and all was respected, until the carpenter's faith came over. In they came with their crosses and their fish and their pale imitation of the goddess that had borne them. To begin with, they were friendly enough, happy to converse and break bread with those they wished to convert. Soon enough that wasn't enough, though. For all their talk of forgiveness and charity, they soon became jealous and hungry, unwilling to honour the old gods as equals. Then, fueled by self-righteous piety and misplaced dedication, they began to seek out the old places, the sacred groves, the henges and the tors, and take them over one by one. Over the years they'd learned that if they planted the symbols of their new religion on the sites of the old, if they renamed the ancient festivals and ignored the dedication of household idols, that the fickle would flock to them, and little by little the old ways would become less than a memory. They came in like cuckoos, and by the time they were done they'd even managed to turn the horned god into their symbol of the basest evil. Then, soon enough, whenever they looked at the stones of the great henge at Knowlton, all they could see was stone for a church. So, with pixes and axes and shovels and hands, they tore them down, broke them up, and built themselves an insult, an unmistakable affront to those that had nurtured them for eons. Affronted and enraged, the old gods took what little power remained to them, and right there at Knowlton they cursed the land they had once protected, turned a site of celebration into a locus of vengeance, and built the henge into the apex of their displeasure. From that day forth, no church built within its ramparts would stand, no worshipper who prayed within its walls would go unpunished, and no soul that died there would know peace. The first church, the one created from the henge's bones, was destroyed by a storm not long after, crushing the life out of 17 worshippers as it fell. With no more stone to build from, a thatch and timber structure was erected next, one that proved good fuel for the fire that consumed it and the pious creatures that dwelt within. More churches followed, and some lasted longer than others, but sooner or later they all came crumbling down. Either by fire or flood or human folly, they'd all fall, and each time they did, more souls would be trapped within the henge. By the time that King Harold had lost his kingdom, and the Normans sat upon the throne, even the most devout of men had lost count of how many churches at Knowlton had fallen. By then it was a little like the seasons, and truth be told, most of the villagers considered the alehouse a holier place of worship than the accursed church they had inherited. However, if there's one thing that new dynasties like to do, it's build, especially when they've been told that building churches may guarantee them a place in heaven. So, soon enough, the new Norman lord replaced the tumble-down wooden shack with the sturdy stone edifice we know today. Once it was finished, he commanded all of his tenants to attend the first mass held within its walls. They all knew the stories of what had befallen the churches built before, and fearful of what might happen, many stayed away. However, Norman lords were well known for their cruelty, and so fearful of repercussion, many more obeyed. The service started well enough, with greetings and observances and recitations in Latin, all of which were well received until a tall, shadowy figure, familiar to those who'd had reason to walk through the henge at night, began to manifest behind the priest. To begin with, it could have been mistaken for tendrils of smoke billowing from the incense burners, but little by little those tendrils grew into twisted, malformed limbs that wrapped themselves around the priest until he was all but enveloped by the thing that had seized him. Before they could even think to panic or flee from the pews, a swirling white mist trapped the congregation, a thick, choking mist filled with the chattering of disembodied voices begging to be released. A panic seized them as the wine in the communion chalice began to boil over, and the walls began to drip with a pale, viscous slime that smelt of death and hatred. Panic then turned to terror as the priest was held aloft and twisted into a creature of pure suffering. His skin was removed first, not in great chunks, but in thin tendrils peeled in spirals from his limbs. Then the ribs at his back were snapped, and through the wounds that they left, the priest's lungs were pulled out and stretched into the shape of angelic wings. The priest remained there, suspended as a mocking insult to those that worshipped the carpenter. It's not known how many died trying to escape the church that day, but it is known that the building itself stood, and rather than abandon it, the local bishop decreed that it was their holy duty to defeat the heathen spirits within. So, out came the holy water and out came the prayers, and after weeks of incantations, the mist and the figures within it finally dispersed. Ecstatic at their victory, they rededicated the building and welcomed the locals back inside. All seemed well at the time. It appeared to all that the evil had been defeated and the church was now free from its curse. The old gods, though, the old gods are patient. As ancient as they are, centuries mean nothing to them, and so they waited. They allowed the followers of the usurper to become comfortable, and they waited. Soon enough, though, their patience was rewarded. After 3 centuries of waiting, Knowlton had become prosperous. The village had become fat with trade, the inhabitants plump and complacent, and the church rich from tithes and tributes. All was well until the dreams began. One night, without warning, every villager dreamt of a tall, shadowy figure moving as if it was made of smoke, then climbing on top of them as they lay frozen beneath, and breathing the foulest of vapours into their open mouths. Their priest assured them that it was simply a dream, that their faith would protect them and all would be well. And then the pestilence came. With weeping sores and bleeding eyes, it struck the village without mercy. Men, women and children, none were spared, and all suffered. After 2 days, the affliction rendered them half blind. After 5, it turned every inch of their skin into an agonizing open sore, and after 7, the infected were little more than putrid sacks of corrupting fluid begging for their lives to end. In search of succour and mercy, they retreated to the church, where the parish priest and the superfluity of nuns did what little they could. After a week, none remained that weren't afflicted, and the inside of that church became little more than a stinking charnel house overflowing with misery and desperation. It almost came as a relief when the white mist descended once more, for at least then those inside were spared the sight of their kinsmen dying. But what little relief it offered proved to be short-lived, for not long after those shadowy figures appeared again. Not one this time, but hundreds, swirling like corrupted souls dancing on hateful eddies of bitterness and scorn, whispering accusations as they went. One by one the shadows seized the patient and their carers alike, and held them aloft, spread-eagled and desperate, as ragged strips were torn from their flesh, plaited into bleeding sinewy rope, and then used to tie the poor wretches to the walls in a gruesome parody of crucifixion. They all begged, of course, and prayed, and tried to run, but all were seized and all were punished, and when they were done the shadows turned their attention to the building itself. Joining one another in an ominous black cloud, they concentrated themselves into a Stygian ball of gleaming hatred, and released every ounce of the old god's savage resentment in one overwhelming moment of explosive destruction that left Knowlton Church as we see it today. Weeks later, a group of traders entered the village, wishing only to sell their goods, but instead found nothing less than the remains of a nightmare. Not one soul in Knowlton had survived, and what had remained of their bodies would have been considered perverse even in hell. So, desperate for their Lord's grace, they made for Knowlton Church in search of the parish priest and answers, only to find ruins, sacrilege, and desiccated corpses decorating its crumbling walls. Not long after, the High Sheriff decreed that in the name of the Crown, what remained of the village should be razed to the ground and ploughed under the earth, never to be inhabited again. The church, though, they let that be. After what had happened, all who knew it knew to stay clear, and those who didn't soon learned to. Nowadays, of course, it still receives plenty of visitors, as ancient ruined buildings often do, but only the reckless or unwise ever dare to stay within the henge at night. Those who do soon see the mist for themselves and hear the chattering voices that come with it. Even those who visit during the daytime often report catching sight of a ghostly face at the top of the tower, or a weeping nun at one of the windows, echoes of those who were punished for the offence of their forefathers. The least fortunate, though, they might catch a glimpse of one of the shadow figures that reign within the henge. Should this happen, they're sure to get a visit that night and wake the following morning with a malady none can cure. So, if you ever do find yourself paying a visit to Knowlton Church, make sure you're gone before night descends, and be mindful of what you see. The old gods might have had their fun, but no one holds a grudge like they do.